Kia ora koutou, welcome to Top Talks, and this week we have with us Professor David Frame from, who is the Director of the New Zealand Climate Change Research Institute. Is that correct?
Yes, got it. Well done.
Awesome. Welcome, Dave. Big round of applause for Dave, folks. And Dave, you've had a bit of a checkered history, so if you want to maybe talk us through a bit of your background.
Sure, yeah, I'm from Southland. I'm from just outside Invercargill, which I think is... he's from Northland, so he thinks that's pretty checkered.
The far north, opposite ends of the country.
That's right, and I must admit, Northland are always the team I like least in rugby, and I think it's just for that geographical reason. So I've never been there, actually.
You should.
So I guess my background is I did an undergrad degree in physics and philosophy, and then a master's in astronomy and astrophysics, and then a PhD in physics. And I went and worked, and this is where I first met Geoff, was going off to the Treasury and working there as a policy analyst, because it was a slightly unusual skill set. And obviously they don't hire economists anymore. So that was a really interesting experience. And then I went away to the University of Reading for a couple of years as a postdoc, and then I joined the University of Oxford and spent about 10 years there working on global climate issues. And I guess the interesting thing that kind of dawned on me partway through that was that it was unusual to have a background in policy and climate physics. So I suppose what I've sort of specialised in is the bits of climate science that I think affect policy and people's lives and so on, and the other disciplines I'm interested in, like philosophy. So I guess that's where I kind of come from, and I guess it's also why I have a slightly scattergun approach to the issues that interest me.
And as many critical-minded people often end up, you're in that kind of unenviable position of having people who think you're not green enough and people who think you're too extreme. So I mean, climate change, really big picture. I mean, does it keep you awake at night? Does it concern you? What where do you think you? What would you like people to know about your position on climate change before we dive into the detail?
I'm bog standard IPCC in a lot of ways. I think think it's one of the world's gravest problems. It intersects with a whole bunch of other of the world's gravest problems, like weak governance, like food insecurity, poverty, to create a really nasty future for a lot of people in the world. I guess I also am pretty much a pretty regular, I was at the Treasury, right? So I think markets are an efficient way to allocate goods and services under some conditions, but not under others. And you have government failure, and you have market failure, and you have all these sort of things. So I have a pretty standard liberal position, I suppose, on the global economy. Yet I think climate change is a really big problem. So I'm in a conjunction that is less populated than I guess I would have thought it would have been. A lot of the people who are most committed to climate change are determined that more markets aren't the right answer. And a lot of people who are most committed to, economic liberalism, political liberalism, are not that troubled by climate. So when you are troubled by climate, but you think that actually that more of the sorts of governance we have are part of the solution, you can find yourself a bit lonely at times.
When you say we have, you mean like New Zealand's Western liberal democracy?
Yeah, the kind of I guess the sort of economist reader kind of approach, I guess. Is that close enough?
Yeah.
I don't have a party political home.
No.
So I'm a swing voter.
Yeah.
So.
We don't, we don't ask on these things deliberately. We don't ask who you vote for, so that our experts can maintain their independence. But okay, so then so you obviously climate change, one of the big issues.
Yeah.
Where do you think we sit in terms of our response, both as a planet and as a country?
Right. Well, so the main end goal of stabilising temperature is what you need to do is stop emitting fossil fuel emissions into the atmosphere. You've got to get to net zero on fossil carbon, and that's fossil methane and fossil CO2. And if you do that, you'll be almost there. That's an almost sufficient condition for stopping temperature increase. Whether you do that fast or slow determines, and how much you burn on the way determines how much warming you get. At the moment, we've made aspirational plans to keep warming somewhere between 1.5 and 2, and we are not on course to deliver on those aspirations. That doesn't make it, that's not unique, right? The world makes a whole bunch of collective promises, the nations of the world via the UN, that it turns out it doesn't live up to. So make poverty history, a whole bunch of things. If you look down the list of UN resolutions, you see that it turns out that very often our intentions, our actions don't line up with our intentions. So I think one of the things we need to do is obviously we need to stop temperatures increasing. So I think we absolutely have to stop emitting fossil carbon. That's the main goal. It would be nice if we can live up to our aspirations. I don't personally think we're on course to do that, and I doubt we will. And then I think it's a question of limiting the damage as best we can.
So that's as a globe.
Yep.
Just to get a bit depressing for a moment.
Yep.
Where do you see things heading as a globe in terms of temperatures before we get our shit together and actually act?
It's very hard to say, and it's determined mainly by the behaviour of a group of demographically large countries that are newly global middle class. So India, China, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, the G20 countries who aren't in the G8. And I think we know that the global north will reduce emissions, and they've got to keep going until they get to zero. But it's about the behaviour of those large countries who are going to keep temperature towards the low end. They're going to have to reduce emissions or not start emissions more than they have planned to this point. They hold the key, and the people who are most damaged are the third group in the world, who are the folks who aren't yet part of the global middle class. They're the ones who are most at risk from this problem. So there's a lot of ways in which it's actually a south-south problem. We kind of know what our strategy will be. We may do it better or worse, or faster or slower, but we know what we ought to do, and we probably can. It's a question of mobilising those investments, mobilising political constituency behind those investments, but we sort of know what our plan is. But it's really about, I think, persuading the folks in those big countries that they ought to be part of the solution too. That's the global picture.
I mean, there is kind of this talkback truism of you know, the next step down from denying climate change exists is to sort of say, oh well, but China's not going to do anything about it, so why should we bother? One,
I think China are doing something about it, and China changed tack quite rapidly after the Copenhagen meeting in 2009, and they have become the world's largest provider of lots of renewable technology. I think if they can corner the market on some of the most promising technologies, they'll do a lot. I also don't see any prima facie reason why we should think that China care less about the fate of the rest of the world than we do. So I think that's a little bit of Western conceit to assume that you know, we care but they don't. And China and New Zealand emit per capita not that much different stuff. So we think they ought to reduce. We ought to reduce.
Yeah. So come on through, guys. So that's kind of the global picture, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But as a country, how do you think New Zealand's doing in terms of our own emissions reduction?
Reduction isn't really happening. The targets we've announced, I've always had the view that credibility flows from policies to targets and not the other way around. And I get frustrated by the conversation that says you set your target and then you back your policy out of it, because it's not credible. So I give an example that if Geoff and I are sitting here on the couch and I say I'm going to run the Wellington half marathon next year, and all I do is sit here and eat Doritos and drink Emerson's Pilsner, which is very fine beer, then it's probably illegal. I've thrown myself now. And all I do is sit here, but I say I'm going to run the Wellington half, then it's not hugely credible, right? And then if Geoff comes along a little bit later and I'm still here on the couch, like months later, and he says, Dave, you're not on course to run the Wellington half. And I go, I'll run the marathon. I strengthen my target. I'll run the marathon, that'll show you. Have I made myself more or less credible? So this idea that cranking up the target is the answer flies in the face of everyday experience. It's just not the right way round. So our targets have never been a major problem in my view, and I wrote an affidavit for the Crown on this, that our previous target was consistent with 2 degrees. If you did the numbers and you worked out the rate of decline, it intersected with a set of numbers that the IPCC said that the world as a whole needed to do to be on course for 2 degrees. The current set of targets that are being debated in Parliament are consistent with 1.5 degrees, more or less. And depending on a little bit of luck and depending on exactly what you mean by certain things like biogenic methane, the targets aren't the problem. The problem is that CO2 continues to grow, and methane's been stable, but there's no pressure on it. So if methane isn't growing, I know we're going to talk about this later. If methane isn't growing, it's not appreciably contributing to warming. If it's sinking at more than about minus 0.3% per year, it's undoing previous warming. So if methane's stable, it's not really the problem. Well, you don't want it to grow because then it has a strong warming effect. But the CO2 we emit has grown, and New Zealand's, and part of that is population, that New Zealand's population has grown by about 40% in about 30 years. And New Zealand's emissions have grown by a little more than that, I think, and CO2 emissions. So what we've got is we've got more people and we're driving more cars, and that's the main. That's
basically the story.
The main driver.
Yeah.
And we haven't thought about this in a joined up way. So we don't have a plan for urban form and transport that lets us deliver more migration, which this is a value judgment, but in my view has been terrific for New Zealand. We don't have a joined up plan to have a migration plan and a climate plan all at once.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people would agree migration has been fantastic. We just haven't provided for it.
We haven't had the infrastructure. We haven't developed. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And now we're massively behind.
We are. Yeah.
So New Zealand's, our target's probably fine, but we haven't actually done much. That's a basic summary. So
yes.
Just to pull back to that global picture for a moment, then, if we're heading for, well, you didn't give us a number, but more than 2 degrees.
Yeah.
I mean,
we can use 2.5 as a reference point, right? It might be more, it might be less.
You think that's where we might be?
I would like to think lower, but sure.
Yeah. So you can see a future where where the world does. I mean, 2.5 is the world's actually getting it. If it's stabilising at that sort of level, the world actually does get its act together and does act, but probably just a little bit too late.
Yeah.
So
a little bit later than we would like.
Yeah, a little bit.
But there is no evidence that there is a well-known hard soft threshold for global climate impacts.
Yeah.
In these numbers. So sometimes people posit this tipping points, but at the global level and the global parameters, you don't see it. There may be some in the cryosphere or something like that, but on the whole, you don't see that.
So where these international targets have come from, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, they're policy targets, not science.
They're social constructs.
Yeah. So, okay, say we are headed for 2.5 degrees then. Should we be doing more to adapt as well as to reduce our emissions?
Absolutely. And one of the things, New Zealand has long had knowledge gaps in the adaptation area where we haven't We haven't done a great job of investigating some of our vulnerabilities. We've just been awarded a grant from the Endeavour Fund to look at...
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yes, so we're very excited about this one, actually. It's in conjunction with folks overseas in the UK and the US, looking at the changing nature of extremes, both how much things have changed in the past, so how much of different risks are associated with the anthropogenic component of climate change, and then in the future, how extreme events and other risks are likely to evolve. And we've got some great collaborators, we've got some cool stuff already underway, and we're really excited about that. We think it'll help with some of these knowledge gaps here in New Zealand, and we're hoping that some of the other sciences, the biological sciences, for instance, which is the links with climate change in New Zealand's biology are probably understudied. We'd like to see those guys also kind of be able to build some capability and to fill those knowledge gaps so that New Zealand is in a better position to protect the things we care about.
So we'll come back to policy on reducing emissions and adaptation at the end, but just before we move on to methane, which I really wanted to dive deep in with you.
I'm going to need my second pint for that.
Yeah, we can arrange that. Obviously, I mean, just for balance, there's two sides to the climate debate. As you say, you're probably somewhere in a very lonely territory in the middle. But on one side, you have the deniers. Do you have any messages for them?
They're wrong. I mean, it's really clear. The evidence is really clear. The best sentence in the last IPCC assessment, the big one in 2013, was human influence on the climate is clear. And it's right. Like the evidence for it is like Mike Williams, the director of Deep South here in New Zealand, he has a good analogy. He says that the deniers often try and pretend that the evidence for climate change is like an inverted pyramid. And if you take out that one piece at the bottom, it'll all collapse. But it's actually totally the other way up. That the evidence is like a pyramid, and you pull out a stone and go, ta-da, and nothing happens. All the rest of the evidence is still there saying exactly the same thing.
So you might see one thing's going on.
Yeah.
But what about this?
Yeah.
And you're like, yeah, so what?
Yes, there is no credible, plausible story that matches the spatio-temporal history of the climate over the last 100 years that doesn't include a dominant role for greenhouse gases.
And so why do we have these fucking geologists? It's geologists, isn't it?
Oh, man.
Whenever you see in the media that there's a scientist or a group of 10 scientists that sign this thing saying this is all a waste, it's always geologists.
But they're from the petrochemical industries, almost always.
Oh,
but not always.
Geologists.
But I'm not saying all geologists are bad. Some geologists are lovely, wonderful people.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I'm in a department that has geologists in it, and they're very fine folks.
So you're saying there might be some...
But there are some geologists. Geologists are overrepresented in climate deniers. So are astronomers, which, as a former astronomer, kind of appalls me. Yeah. But they have something in common.
Are you getting confused with astrologers?
They're almost all emeritus. They're almost all about 70 or more. And there's a cohort effect here that people find change really challenging.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. The quip about astrologers wasn't entirely wrong, because that moon guy, what's the moon guy?
Oh, Ken Ring.
Ken Ring, the moon guy.
Is he still around?
He's still around, and my aunties still love him. I'm sorry, aunties. And he's a denier. I couldn't believe it. Anyway, guessing. We're going to reach these influencers, Dave. Ken Ring is an influencer. Okay, so that's the deniers.
Yeah.
So on the other side, there's kind of this narrative about... I mean, as you say, this is one of the biggest threats facing the globe, but there's conversations now about 1.5 to stay alive.
Yeah.
That 12 years before we're all insert expletive here.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. And I guess this kind of relates to your, you have a pessimistically optimistic view that we'll end up maybe about 2.5 degrees, and how do you think that's going to look as a world and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But what would your message be to those who are wanting us to panic?
So panic is not usually a good answer, right? Can you think of many examples in your life when panic was a really, really good idea? There are several features of it, but one the fundamental objection I have to a lot of it is that it's also, as the deniers do, it's twisting the science. So if we have 12 years at the moment at the rate of current burn, current emissions, till we're done with the 1.5 degree budget, that does not mean we have 12 years to save the planet. That means we have 12 years at current rates until we're past that budget. So to give especially young people the impression that something horrible happens to the world after 12 years is unnecessarily pessimistic, probably demotivating, and actually probably... So what climate change involves is a large investment in our collective welfare, and especially it involves you making an investment, New Zealand making an investment that we don't see the benefits of but everybody else does, right? It's a classic public good. If I think that the world is going to turn into a violent Hobbesian place in 12 years, where it's going to be a war of all against all, the last thing I do is make an investment in somebody else, because they're my rival, not my friend. So the politics, because a lot of these people just don't think like political realists, they don't get that that's how others will hear their narrative. So I think what they actually do is prevent investment in collective well-being rather than enable it. Do I need to go through that again? Do you get that? Do you understand?
So there's a delicate balance between providing enough poke up the bum to motivate people to do something, but not freak them out so that they start digging bunkers and collecting baked beans.
Yeah, you're collecting baked beans and owning hardware. You know, we don't want them to do that.
Yeah.
But
we
also,
want them to share hardware.
Yeah, exactly. We want them to share. We want them to share non-emitting energy sources, and we want them to not invest in military, bombers and things like that.
Yeah.
So but also I think that's where the evidence. We tend to be overly optimistic about technology in the long run and overly pessimistic in the other way around. Overly optimistic in the short run and overly pessimistic in the long run. And when change happens, it can happen really fast. I was trying to explain to my 6-year-old daughter that there was a time not only before mobile phones, but before phones. And that her granddad, my dad, who grew up in Central Otago, not Southland, so it's counted as a civilised part of the world?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I think Dad...
What about that Clutha River?
Dad didn't... I don't think they had a flush toilet in the house. They didn't have a phone. He grew up, and she can see him. He's right there, and she cannot imagine this world. And so change can come through your life technologically at an amazing rate, and it's an amazing rate historically, but it's not an amazing rate when you're living each week to week. I'm an optimist about long-run technology, and that's why I'm prepared to say 2 point something, even 2.3. But I'm a pessimist about human nature in the sense that I just don't think that moral arguments that you should go without so that somebody else can have ever actually motivate. People don't behave that way. So kind of what's the point? I mean, it helps in a sense that for some people that's a strong motivator. If technology investments are made, there will be pots of money at the end of the rainbow, because people will deploy those technologies, but we shouldn't be Pollyanna-ish about international relations.
Yeah. So we have to paint a positive picture about what the world looks like, a low carbon world, where we can live centrally and ride our bicycles and which I think is fantastic because I like bicycles. Anyway, so I'm going to ask you about methane in just a moment. So I think if someone can bring Dave another beer, that would be helpful. But just before you dive into that, can you briefly paint a picture of what? Thanks, James. Of what 2.5 degrees looks like, so that we don't, so that we have a sense of whether we should panic or not.
I don't think I didn't see that one coming.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I'd find that hard. I mean, things would be a lot worse than we expect.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't be unendurable. They would be unendurable in some parts of the world, and I would fully expect that millions of people would die. But I also don't, as a result of climate change, that wouldn't be the case if we stayed under 2 degrees. So I think that the number of deaths would go up. But I also think that some of that could be ameliorated by better poverty reduction programs, by deeper aid programs, by collective investments in adaptation and so on, things like that. So it's not like there's this deterministic world at 1.5, 2, 2.5. Quite how palatable those worlds are depends on other investments we make alongside it. So you should see it as a coupled system. And if we have the surplus, because we will only make those investments in places like the Sahel, which is one of the most vulnerable parts of the world.
Where's that?
The Sahel, the top of the tropical zone and the bottom of the desert in North Africa.
Oh yeah.
So Lake Chad, so Mali, Chad, Mauritania, those kind of countries. They face a really, really grim future with climate change. But if we invest so much in mitigation that we don't feel we have a surplus to invest in adaptation in deeply vulnerable parts of the world, or if we have a nationalist reaction against that kind of investment, that will lead to a worse world. So I think it's kind of not right to portray a world with a fixed set of damages, fixed pattern of damages, and you get this much or that much. It's coupled back with the economy and society and the value judgments we make.
Yeah. But I guess the point is that for people to take away is the world doesn't end at a certain temperature.
No.
It
doesn't run away either. Yeah. So you don't have runaway. So the evidence is that you don't get a runaway greenhouse effect. Like we can't turn into Venus. Venus is like 700 degrees or something. We won't do that, right? So it's not a runaway situation. The evidence is quite strongly that the relationship between cumulative emissions of carbon and warming is pretty linear out quite a way. Certainly across the range we're talking about here.
Okay, cool, great. So that's the really big picture.
Good.
Now on to methane.
Yeah.
And so obviously methane's a big deal to New Zealand because we emit a lot of it, and it comes from the backbone of our economy, agriculture. So it's logical that we'd want to talk about that probably more than most countries, but there is also a pretty good scientific basis for talking about methane in a different way to carbon dioxide.
That's right.
And you were alluding to it before. Do you have a nice simple way of getting this across?
I'm probably going to wave my hands really vividly here. So carbon dioxide is a stock pollutant in the sense that about half of every unit builds up in the atmosphere. Half decays quite quickly, but more or less half of it sticks around for 1,000 years or more. Nitrous oxide sticks around for over 100 years. It's got a single decay. Carbon dioxide doesn't actually have a single decay timescale, so that's why I'm a bit vague about that. Nitrous oxide sticks around for over 100 years. So those are long-lived greenhouse gases, and every unit you emit adds to warming.
As a carbon dioxide, mainly from fossil fuels?
Overwhelmingly from fossil fuels. Yeah. Some from land use. And actually New Zealand's biggest contribution to climate change is chopping down all those trees in the 19th century.
Right.
So deforestation is New Zealand's, and land use changes soil carbon coming out of the soil, is New Zealand's biggest term in the climate equation.
Yeah. And nitrous from agriculture?
From agriculture, from fertilizers and all those sort of things. Yep. Nitrous is, and that's a stock pollutant as well. So every unit, more warming. Now, things that don't hang around very long are flow pollutants. So the difference here is between, so a stock pollutant might be asbestos or lead or mercury in your blood. It builds up, each unit kind of builds up. I don't know about asbestos actually, I presume so, but certainly the metals do. Whereas
1080. 1080 is a good example. It's a flow pollutant because our body, 1080 is a natural toxin. It's in tea actually. 1080 is in tea, very low levels. But if you were to drink swimming pools worth of tea, you would die of 1080 poisoning.
Wow. Alcohol. Alcohol is a flow pollutant.
It's a flow pollutant. So your body can process it.
Yeah, breaks down. Rate. Yeah, that's right.
But if you get more than enough in one big dose, it can kill you.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So exactly. So methane, biological methane, what happens is you fix a carbon atom, a carbon atom from a CO2 molecule in a piece of grass. Cow eats grass, ingests carbon atom, methane comes out of cow. And so there's this, you're not adding
Incidentally, just to cover up, just to close any speculation that might be on this, it's actually not so much the farts, right?
I don't know, I can never remember.
It's the burps.
Yeah, okay.
They're foregut fermenters now.
Foregut
Foregut
fermenters.
Yeah.
Foregut fermenters, we're hindgut fermenters, so we fart them.
We fart, they
I
burp.
never knew that. That's awesome.
The summary for
Gee,
folks
that's
at
great.
home. It's the summary of that little tidbit of information.
That's superb. That's superb. This is such an informative political party.
Anne's actually chair of our policy, a member of our policy committee, yeah.
Excellent.
So,
Not a chair, mate.
Yeah.
technically, yeah.
So-
at the moment. Anyway, yeah.
So methane, so biological methane is a flow pollutant, and it hangs around for 9 years or so and decays. And the point here is that we have this method of equivalence that dates from the early 90s. And I can tell you all about the history of that if you like, but it's a bit random. But
Yeah.
But
basically, it was made up.
it was made up because they said, well, we want to compare these with those. And to this guy, Don, can you do that? And Don said, yeah, okay. And so he said, well, we'll fix the time interval, 100 years, radiative forcing. So we compare the 100-year time-integrated radiative forcing effects of a species of something versus a kilo of CO2. And they got this number. But what it masks is the fact that flow things don't stick around and stock things do. And what it means is, there was and that kind of rumbled along under the Kyoto Protocol, and when we were just expecting to reduce emissions. And it wasn't that big a deal because it was only rich countries involved in the Kyoto Protocol, and everyone had to just try and get started. But then there were a series of papers in 2009, and Miles Allen and I led one of them, and Malta Meinshausen led another, and they said, oh look, it's a cumulative, especially our paper said, cumulative CO2 versus temperature, there's a really strong relationship. And what that means is because it's cumulative CO2, because it's stock pollutant, there's a binding intergenerational budget for a given warming. So for 2 degrees of warming from CO2, there's about 1 trillion tonnes of carbon burned as carbon dioxide that you can emit and stay under that limit. But of course because it's a flow pollutant, there is no binding intergenerational budget associated with methane. So if you are a rice grower, rice is the second biggest source of methane, and you've been growing rice this way for 1,000 years, and you keep growing rice that way over the next 100 years, you are not adding further to warming, you are simply replacing the warming that was already there.
So it's just if we have more rice fields or more cows.
Then it goes up. And it's a steep, because it's a powerful greenhouse gas trapper, the relationship between increases or decreases in methane and warming are much stronger than what the equivalence says. So the issue with the traditional notion of equivalence is that it under-penalises increases in methane, and it under-rewards decreases in methane, and it overprices just a constant flow of methane. So we made, I mean, this point's sort of been understood for a long time, sort of. And we made the point a couple of years ago. Miles Allen, who's a colleague of mine...
He's kind of a big deal.
We think it's a big deal.
Well, Miles Allen's a big
Miles.
deal. In case you don't know,
Yeah,
search Miles Allen on the internet.
Yeah.
He's a big deal, and he's mates with Dave, so therefore Dave's a big deal too.
Does big dealness work like that? I mean...
I'm trying to summarise
okay.
the whole of the scientific approach.
Yeah, so, so anyway, so the point is... that
the point is people look at our emissions and go, holy shit, half of our emissions are methane, we've got to kill all the cows.
Yeah, and we said you don't have to kill all the cows. And we said, in fact, what you have to do is if you have a fixed number of cows, it's not adding much to warming, like more or less, there's a little bit, but not much. And then you get on with the CO2, right, which is the main event, because that's the bit with the binding intergenerational budget. It's also the overwhelming source of climate change, and it's an even more overwhelming source of climate change since 1980. So it's the main event, and it's getting more main. And another big deal, Rapier Humbert, Halley Professor of Physics at the University of Oxford. Oh man,
Or her.
he just doesn't read enough planetary climate texts.
Sorry.
Can we put things on the top reading list?
Please do.
So folks like Ray think, for instance, that as long as we're not making progress on CO2, it doesn't matter what we do with the other stuff. And I think the same. I think that's right. So
taking care of methane is necessary but not sufficient. Taking care of carbon
is virtually sufficient.
Is
right. Near as damn it. Okay. We shouldn't let methane grow, and nobody is arguing. Nobody, as far as I know, is arguing that methane should not be regulated by climate policy. So that's a common misinterpretation of what we're saying. People say, "Oh, you're just trying to give a free pass for dairy." No, we're actually saying you should much more steeply penalise growth in methane emissions. So I gave a talk to the feds last year, and somebody said, "Oh, we like what Dave says," and I said, "Don't be too sure about that, because if they had a spike in demand, I would say you can't meet it, at least not unless you cut methane from somewhere else."
Yeah.
Whereas at less than a latte per cow, which is the current proposal, you can totally meet it, and you get a lot of change.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're arguing for a way of comparing methane to CO2 that has a lot more environmental integrity. We have warming targets, so we should back the accounting out of warming. We should look to limit warming. That's what we said we'd do in Paris.
Yeah. And so what would that then give us for a methane target?
Well, can I have a sip?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, that depends on. This is where I really want to do the hand thing. But basically, you can trade off a little bit of wind flexibility about getting to zero with a level flexibility on where you stabilise your methane. It's the only form of equivalence you can have.
Can you say that last bit again?
Yeah, that sounds like it's worth saying again.
If you come down that fast on CO2 or that fast, right? So a little wedge there, you can balance that with a wedge in altitude on your methane. Okay. So that's CO2. With the wedge?
Yeah. So if we cut methane, then if we cut our methane emissions, then we can take longer to get to net zero.
A little
bit longer.
A little. No more than a few years. So this is one of the reasons why it's a little bit of a pointless conversation, because if you dither by more than about, globally, if you dither by more than about 5 years or something like that on CO2, then you blow away any effect like that from methane. So methane really is it's pretty marginal. But so we argued, yes, it's fair to it's totally fine to set a methane target lower than today's level, but the main action really ought to be on getting those CO2 emissions down. And this is where the frustration has been, how much of the debate about targets has been about the add-on and not the main event. So tell me what the plan is to reduce CO2, and tell me what the policy initiatives are. Because it's the wrong thing to say to a political party, isn't it? But
you're speaking generically.
It's a rhetorical. Tell me.
Yeah.
So we have to. If transport's to play its role, we've a very good PhD student that Rafe Chapman and I have, Muhammad Arif Hassan, and Arif's work says probably need another $1 at the petrol pump to reduce CO2 from the vehicle fleet at about, to be consistent with the previous target, the minus 30 on 2005 by 2030 target.
Yeah.
So you could do that. We have seen real petrol prices that high before in the 80s.
What does that do to, what does that mean in terms of a carbon price, $1 on petrol? Do you know?
Well, we didn't cascade that through the whole economy. We just looked at just at transport and say, how much would it take to move this sector by that much?
Yeah.
And the answer was a lot more than voters would put up with.
Yeah.
But maybe not. Voters have seen that price before. And the other thing is that there are smart ways and dumb ways of introducing fuel prices. One of the dumb ways, which is very common, is that you subsidise petrol, which many countries do. And actually New Zealand's greatest contribution to climate policy is the underappreciated role we had in setting up Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, which is the sort of stuff that you would love, right? Like taking away all the negative prices on carbon before you put the positive price on carbon. And Tim Grosser deserves a pat on the back for that.
He does.
Good job.
Oh, well done, Tim. That's the first time I've said that sentence. Well done, Tim Grosser.
So do the negotiators, actually. They're probably, point here is that, what was the point? I'm drifting a bit.
It's hard to act on carbon, but we got
normally the time you want to take off those subsidies on petrol is when the Treasury is feeling the burn at the top of a commodity price cycle. But actually the time to do it is on the downside of commodity price cycle, when you stick prices on or you take subsidies off, when the consumer would be getting that benefit, but you say you're not having that. And then the consumer doesn't feel a price rise, they just don't feel a fall. So you could introduce a ratchet policy, for instance, that lets you bank that the environment, bank those commodity dips, but keep the commodity peaks. So you let the market push the price up, and you just don't let it come back down.
Clever.
Sneaky.
Yeah, but wonderful. No, I like it. So, just to come back to methane versus carbon.
Yeah.
I mean, it all sounds fantastic in theory that we should be. So our goal should be to stabilise methane, maybe reduce it a bit, but we have to get to
zero CO2.
We have to get to zero CO2.
Yeah.
So the trouble is that we've got these targets that we've agreed in Paris and under Kyoto and all this sort of stuff. In an international system which includes methane.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
Paris is not Kyoto. Paris had a whole bunch of rules, and it spelled out a whole bunch of stuff about how you were to do things. Paris leaves almost everything to countries.
So we could just define out methane of our target and say we're reducing carbon by 30%. Job done.
We could say we're going to cut methane by 30% and get to zero on carbon. That is consistent. If we applied those settings to the global emissions, that would be totally consistent, more than consistent with 1.5 degrees. Nick Leach from Oxford has done some modelling which shows that actually a much lower cut would still be consistent with the 1.5 target. Depending on how you define biological methane emissions in the global databases and all these other things. But basically 30% cut in methane and zero on carbon is a perfectly respectable policy from a 1.5 degree world perspective.
But our 2030 target includes...
If we do that, so it's not a line, if we delay on CO2, well, that's different, isn't it? Because then we start to chew up the budget a bit more.
Well, no, I'm thinking if we've got this 2030 target that we have to, which was minus 10% on our 1990 emissions. Is that right? Something like that.
The number's the same, but the trajectory is different. So it's yes, it is, but what it mainly is minus 30% on 2005. So that suggests a steeper rate of decline than minus 10 on... It's like a roof. If you look from one side of an angle roof to the other, you can say it's flat. But if you look from the peak down, it's angled. And it was defined on the angle, not flat. Flat was the flat interpretation was given by environmentalists who wanted to chuck rocks at it, which is totally legitimate because it was the same number. But there was an implicit rate of change that it implied that was not captured by that interpretation.
But don't we have to deliver on whatever that 2030 target is? Don't we have to deliver that target on a system which equivalises methane to carbon dioxide?
I don't think so. I don't. When did Kyoto Targets, the whole Kyoto thing ended?
Kyoto's gone, yeah.
Yeah. A long time ago. I don't think that the rule book on Paris is anywhere near that deterministic.
Right. Okay.
And that's my impression from Adrian Macy. He,
Yeah.
We'll get him to view the video and comment.
Yeah. No, I mean this is an interesting debate, right? Because Because some say that if we continue to exclude the energy intensive industries that currently get a break, and we give methane a free ride, that we've got no chance of meeting our targets. But what you're saying is we could potentially redefine our targets.
No, I don't think we want to play accounting. Playing funny buggers with the accounting is not the right way, right? We all took the high road in the Cricket World Cup final, where we said it shouldn't be decided on some false accounting sort of principle. What we could do is say our heavy industry will take the same hit as all other rich countries' heavy industry, and then when and if they live up to their commitments, we'll be living up to ours.
Yep.
We will increase the price on carbon to a level consistent with,
say Europe.
Say Europe, fine, great.
Which would be at least double what we are now.
Double, yep.
More,
yeah.
I think.
I hadn't realised the exchange rate was so high until I went there recently. It was brutal.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so Europe is streets ahead of us on carbon pricing at the moment.
But they have lots of exceptions too.
Right.
They have, one of the reasons I got grumpy with Geoff a couple of years ago about the article you and Paul wrote, Paul Young, on the flaws in our ETS, because actually all the carbon regulation systems in the world, including the European ETS, have had major problems getting started. Less so now, where there are we've discovered all those problems and we know what not to do. But two, there are other clubs to join. There are other people to fit in with. But the European one initially started with an allocation phase so we moan about grandparenting and things here, but they started with this allocation phase where they said normally they would, measure, do the inputs thing and come up with their national inventories. They said, basically, how much carbon do you emit for the allocation round? Because you're going to get it grandparented. Now, I'm going to say lots, right? Loads, absolutely. And people did. And eventually, a few years later, it was found out quite how much this, I don't know, how would you describe that? Larceny was my word. Do you have a better word?
A rort.
Rort, yeah. So it's certainly playing funny buggers with accounting. So when that was discovered, it was the permit price dropped. And then they did it again in the second round. It was remarkably similar. And so I felt like we ended up with the hot air issue. And yes, we should have choked that off much earlier. But much bigger and allegedly better systems than ours faced exactly the same problems for exactly the same reasons, about fears about competitiveness, unpicking by special interests and all these other things. And I think gradually we'll move away from that. We should expect it and we should forgive it in those large countries that I talked about. They're going to have to do it with per capita incomes in the teens of thousands of US dollars as opposed to twice that in our case. So we ought to be aware that's coming, and that's one of the things that will make emissions reduction less effective than we hope.
Still haven't given me a number for what you want to see methane reduced to.
Oh, can I give you a band?
Yeah.
I'm going to say about, I would say minus 15 to minus 30.
Okay. That's
Did you take a photo of that somehow?
No. I was just checking the time. So that is a bit lower than where the government is going right now.
I just think that
I mean, a bit less lower, a bit higher. The reduction is less.
Yeah, a little. But it also, I don't get why we're going to promise minus 47, which is a spuriously precise number, given the absence of action in this particular area by other countries. We could do more later. And one of the things about Paris that is in there is a ratchet that you're not supposed to undo targets. You're supposed to only ever crank them up one way, right? This is a negotiation, not a telethon. So we ought to start with what we think we can do, without ruining New Zealand, and then work through. And there's an obvious area here for bipartisan, cross-party collaboration on something like that, and then get on with the hard bit. Remember, the hard bit is the CO2.
Yeah.
An extra buck at the fuel pump for that sector alone.
Yeah. So
why not spend your political capital there, and leave the bit you don't need to do less, leave it more alone than why spend all your capital there?
Well, yeah. I don't want to have a conversation about this, but the question I've been asking recently is, given the fresh water reforms going on as well, which is going to do way more than the climate proposals.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Why did the government put all their political capital into sorting out the carbon side of things when
with
actually
the water,
fresh water is a way bigger deal?
So I kind of agree, and it's an easier sell in the sense that New Zealand internalises the costs and benefits of its freshwater decisions.
Yeah, and by the way, at the same time, we would blow what they're planning to achieve on nitrous and methane.
So that's where I would have the target shadow where you're going a little bit, and because on a flow pollutant you can, and a stock pollutant you can't, and a flow pollutant you can. If it turns out things are better in the sense of less methane than you thought, why not mop that up then? So one of the other intertemporal political capital issues that I think is real is that James Shaw and Jacinda Ardern are eating too much of the political capital pie by setting the most ambitious target they can now and not leaving anything for future Labour Green governments to do. So I think they would be better leaving some pie on the table so that others can, I mean, certainly from a bipartisan perspective, if you don't leave anything for National to do but play oppositional politics, why would they ever do anything other than play oppositional politics? You know, bipartisanship also is a commitment to a process and not to an outcome. So if I say to my kids, which I probably sometimes do, let's be bipartisan but totally around my views, that's not the usual interpretation of bipartisan.
Okay, so just to come back to, because you've been saying all along, targets are less important than actual action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that controversial?
No. I think it makes complete sense. What would you be actually doing now on carbon and or methane or agriculture?
I'd be proactively trying to form carbon clubs, which I think New Zealand is part of. So carbon clubs, you set up regimes, for instance, border trade adjustments, things like that. Carrots for people who are inside the mitigation tent or who are undertaking strong mitigation. Sticks for people who aren't. I'd be testing out the WTO on that. I'd be increasing the price on carbon. I'd be thinking very hard about. Now we don't have that many point sources, and that is a useful. It makes it hard to do what Britain did. Britain had a whole bunch that were quite old, shut them down. But they've done a lot more than that as well. 10 years ago I could say that, and it was pretty much all they'd done. I think they have done a lot in the meantime. But I'd be looking to work with the big point sources, and I'd be trying to find a decarbonisation pathway for those industries.
So Fonterra and its coal, for example.
Fonterra's coal bugs me much more than Fonterra's cows.
Yeah.
And I would be looking to carrot and stick them out of that. So I'd be looking to co-fund alternatives to coal, and I'd be looking to price the crap out of them if they didn't do the right thing.
From what I've heard, pretty much if we had a carbon price that was in the league of where Europe did now, I heard $60.
Yeah.
So they would be pretty.
They shouldn't be allowed to do that. And the other thing is that the other thing I'd do is levy a fee on the. So if they're building a boiler in Timaru now, that they think that makes sense at $25 a tonne, but not at 60. But I think that the average price over the lifetime of that boiler is actually going to be more like 80. I would charge them the difference. I don't see what's wrong with that.
It's because a similar idea to what the government's doing with the feedback, trying to increase the cost of petrol cars and reduce the cost of electric cars.
Exactly. And if you do that with a dozen point sources around the country, you could make some significant inroads. And where there are the odd exception like steel or aluminium, and obviously aluminium is close to my heart, then I would form a giant subsidy scheme. No, I would. What I would do is I would think about they get electricity from Manapuri rather than a coal-fired power station. They are one of the cleanest aluminium providers in the world. So I would look to try and think how they can leverage that, what they can do with it, how we can help them not leave.
Well, apparently, if we just charge them for the lines from Manapuri to Tiwai, then because at the moment they're paying a share of the charges of the trunk line, the grid to Okaia.
Oh wow!
Where I'm from.
Yeah. They shouldn't pay for that.
Yeah, no. And that's the one Southland versus Northland thing that I'll agree with you on.
But the other thing is, I would also try and. What was I going to say? I've lost that train of thought now. You've thrown me by saying something nice about Southland. Steel's a bit similar, and I think the case. I think they should go around and look at these industries that do get the special energy intensive deal, and try and figure out a decarbonisation plan for them. And I also think that the just transitions idea is a really good idea, but I think it's really hard to know, because venture capital's hard, and because knowing what future skills are required is hard. It's really hard to know to make it stick. So everyone can kind of agree on general principles, but it's actually quite hard to make it happen. But I think that the spirit of that is worth pursuing, and it would be a bad outcome to have a few failures and then go, let's just bin it, because then I think the people who would suffer from that are the people who will lose their jobs because of mitigation. And all that will do is actually seed a new generation of denial. My experience is that the most climate denying places that I've been in New Zealand is the West Coast, and that's because of the coal. That's because of the legacy there. Your mileage may vary, right?
Okay, it's time for questions, folks. For Dave, have we got any questions? Yeah, I'll pass you the mic.
Two things, Dave. Is that working?
It is working,
Oh,
yeah.
good.
It's just not. Yeah.
Right. If I heard you right, I think you said that 15 to 30% reduction in methane plus the CO2 would line up. But didn't I earlier hear you say that as long as we're not increasing our methane, we're not adding to warming?
Yeah.
So that didn't quite seem to me to tie up.
Yeah.
And the second one, while I've got the mic, what sort of regulation would you suggest for methane in New Zealand?
Okay, so the first one is, I would ask, so you could, basically what would happen is that if the whole world just flatlined its methane and then reduced its CO2 to zero by 2050, that wouldn't quite be consistent with 1.5 degrees. So given that there's an ambition in this country, and it's democratically elected, so I'm happy to roll with it, to be consistent with that 1.5 degrees, that's where I would make the cuts. That would be the pattern that falls out of that. So if I were asked to suggest a global pathway that was broadly consistent with that, I think agriculture taking a hit on its previous warming to that extent is perfectly reasonable. On the second one, I think there were two really good, thoughtful, sophisticated approaches developed last year by the Productivity Commission under Murray Sherwin and Geoff Lewis and those guys, and under Simon Upton's crowd at the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. They were really good, and they deserved a lot more airtime than the government gave them. And one of them was sort of short-long. The Productivity Commission was sort of a short-long split. Remembering that the Montreal Protocol was a short-long baskets. It wasn't one basket. So that was a short-long split. That made sense. Simon Upton's one was more or less a fossil and a land sector.
Yeah.
And either of those, both of those are worth developing. They're worth thinking about. They're worth thinking about what delivers the best outcomes for New Zealand.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah, sure.
The really interesting thing about Simon Upton's proposal is his big concern is that we are going to end up in 2050 still chugging out fossil fuels and have just offset it with planting trees.
And buying overseas purchases.
Yeah, but because we've got so much marginal land, we can just keep planting trees and chugging out fossil fuels and but the trouble is that land is then locked up in perpetuity, right? To hold the carbon.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
so there are people, many economists will say, so that's the right answer. If the marginal costs, if that's the right answer from a cost perspective, that's the right answer. But I think that does two things to future generations. It absolves ourselves, our generations, of the responsibility to decarbonise. It others it to them, and then it takes away all that land from them forever. So from an intergenerational equity perspective, we take away two options, or rather we don't deliver on something we know we need to do, and then we take away future options from them. So I agree with Simon on that. I think, like I say, I thought both reports and their treatment of this issue were really good. They weren't we would disagree about a bunch of stuff, but it's a hell of a lot better than jamming it all in the ETS and just doing it the way Kyoto was done, because the Europeans would like us not to kick up a fuss, which is what I'm scared the current trajectory really is.
I'm just going to throw in a supplementary here. Can you convince the rest of the world? Because it is you, right? I mean, it's you that's having this conversation in international meetings and other people.
Yeah.
Can you convince the rest of the world that methane needs to be treated differently?
We've convinced the science community of the basic arguments that we have made, right? Nobody has pushed back on the science. What we need to do, I think, is get things like Simon and Murray stuff out there and go, look, there's another path up the mountain. And the other thing we need to do, and I think this is where New Zealand is going to lead right now, is if we go to the COP with a non-zero biogenic methane thing, people are going to say why, and there'll be a bunch of European voices, mainly from Climate Analytics and those guys who are Climate Action Tracker, who are very keen to control the process, and they will say, because they've done it wrong. And I'm hoping that the climate research community can basically say, because this is also consistent with that 1.5 degree world. And actually the priorities that a lot of physicists have on this, that actually it really is all about the CO2 until we get very near whatever temperature. And then if you reduce methane, that's great, it all lowers temperatures. If people get to hear us, especially, so the current way of doing it, jamming it all in one box and saying it's GWP 100 carbon equivalents, would imply that countries like Kenya have to undo a lot of their warming, while countries like Germany don't. And that's morally wrong, in my view. And we need countries like Kenya to understand, and we've thought about this way more than any other country, and we need countries like Uruguay, Thailand, Kenya to understand that this accounting system is a legacy project, and that it shouldn't be necessarily part of that going forward. If the world has an open and honest conversation about it and settles back on this way of doing things, okay, but the point deserves to get heard.
Cool. Yeah. You got another question? I think. All right. Yep.
Just a question on industrial heat or industrial gas.
Yeah.
Do you think we're better to transition to, say, electrification, or can we produce gas on a renewable basis and that's going to be all right?
What was that last bit? I missed
Can we
it.
produce gas on a renewable basis and therefore continue to use gas as a form of industrial heat? Biofuel. Yeah.
I don't know is the short answer. I mean, I'm not close enough. I think once you get close to the technological side of things, there's a hell of a lot of devils in the detail. I'm not close enough to those specific technologies to know. And the thing is that technologies vary from place to place. Their effectiveness, their role, things like biofuels in Iowa shake down differently from ones in the tropics where you get much higher energy content. So, sorry, I don't know.
I'm going to jump in with an uninformed answer though, but because the government's been focused on green hydrogen.
Oh, yep.
And I kind of, I got the tingling on the back of my neck from it just because it felt a little bit picking winnerish, and I do, we seem to have not there's anything wrong with picking winners.
No.
If
The battery adamants.
yeah. Backing winners is absolutely fine. But I mean, there is a bit of it's almost because Japan's into it that we're into it, and I think there's a good conversation to be had about biofuel as well in the context of New Zealand, where we can grow stuff.
Yeah, I agree with all that.
I think one of those is going to be the answer. And we need to take a balanced approach.
There might be more than one answer. I mean, there are. I hear quite a lot on electricity for small vehicles, hydrogen for larger vehicles, and people have talked for years about biofuels in aviation. And it may be that future fuel mixes are just very different. That there isn't. I don't think there'll be one left standing at the end. I fully expect there'll be.
Mix.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
And I like, personally, for some jurisdictions, I think even nuclear ought to be in the mix. We don't need it, but for some jurisdictions, it's probably the right answer. What we need to do is stop emitting.
Yeah, I find it bizarre. I mean, Australia's got shit tons of uranium.
I agree. Yeah,
and they've got a huge.
And they like
desert.
mining, and they like mining stuff.
Yeah.
And they could they love mining stuff, and they're good, well-paid jobs. And just saying it's all got to be solar, well, maybe some of it. But for baseload stuff, you want reliable sources. I'd also go, if I were going to bet like billions of dollars, I would go after tidal, because it's underexploited, it's totally predictable, and I just think it's been underdone. So that would be my winner.
Why do you think it's been underdone?
Oh, this is The Economist in him, right? There are no $10 notes on the street, right? Yeah, because. I don't know, but I do.
Because tidal's been a conversation in New Zealand since
forever. But when have we ever put any money into it?
Yeah.
We've talked about climate impacts forever, and we haven't put any money into that either.
I can tell you one of the issues with tidal, one of the best places in the world to do tidal generation is Cook Strait, but the forces are so great that you burn the turbine.
So I think that's... well,
Technology.
yeah, but turbines aren't the only thing. Like, you could do... Anyway, I got a plan. I got a way to lose all $5 that I have.
Kaipara Harbour's another big possibility for tidal, but of course that's basically where our entire West Coast salmon population comes from.
No, I like the salmon.
Yeah. Snapper.
Snapper. Oh yeah. I don't get much snapper.
So it would be a risk. Anyway, yeah.
So my question is around mitigating methane in cows. Currently there's a farmer in Western Australia called Doug Powell. He's been combining charcoal or biochar with cows so that basically when they're consuming it, they mix char with molasses, and so the porous nature, it means less methane releases. And then when they crap it out, they've been using dung beetles, which there are species you can release in New Zealand as well, to put that carbon into the soil and improve soil health, and that's mitigating the methane. Yeah,
look, I'm not a methane mitigation guy. I mean, the agricultural greenhouse gas folks, I guess, are probably close to those technologies. I don't know. We shouldn't expect that just because we've spent a lot of money on it that we'll get the right answer and others won't.
Okay. This is really like ancient technology that's been
it's Chinese
forgotten.
medicine, isn't it?
Oh, really?
Amazonia.
Amazonia. Right?
When he said they're combining charcoal with cows, I was thinking this is a barbecue joke.
Might make them taste better, but who's to complain about that advantage?
Cool. Any other questions?
Yeah, I've got one. So you touched on this at the beginning, but can you say a little bit more about, do you think groups like Generation Zero, the School Strike for Climate Change, and these groups who are in favour of more action, do you think they've got their demands right?
They've got the demand for more action, right? Absolutely. Gen Zero have done a huge amount of good. I quibble with them a lot because that's what I'm supposed to do, right? But on the whole, I think they've been a big player, really important player in stimulating conversations about climate change in New Zealand. They've been terrific. School Strike, I think the special thing about Greta Thunberg is she's mobilised this latent political force that the future that had no voice and has found its voice. And that voice is damn near sacrosanct. You cannot, the deniers cannot chuck rocks at school kids the way they can at everyone else. Now, I know people have been brutally rude about it, but they've been much less brutally rude, and they can't be brutally rude about their grandkids and all these other, they have constraints. And I think that's been massive. And I don't think we've, you know, that's, it's still playing out. They don't have a coherent set of demands. They shouldn't, they're kids. At Parliament, I stood well away from the speeches because I thought it's just going to annoy me. But the basic mobilisation of these voices in favour of change is their value, and it's huge. And you know, my 6-year-old wants to come along next time and talk about commons problem. We've got a little game we invented to show the tragedy of the commons. My 11-year-old wants to be a hedge fund manager because that's how he rolls.
Nice.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Any other questions? We got one down here.
I thought the discussion on the stock versus the flow and thinking about mercury versus alcohol in your body was really helpful. How much effort should we be putting into taking mercury out of our bodies?
The CO2 reduction stuff.
Yeah.
That is a great question. That's actually the flip side of the historical responsibility argument, or it's at least another dimension in it. We tend to talk, and this is another thing that bears on this business of planting trees rather than mitigating. So thanks for raising it. It's that we tend to talk about the trees to plant as is doing that instead of reducing CO2. What we should do, I think, is some fraction of reducing that CO2 and then undoing previous warming through these trees. So maybe the trees belong to previous generations and they discharge their obligations to live within that budget. So we could think about the problem quite differently, but there's no a priori reason why morally speaking we own that sink and we can use that sink instead of doing something. So yes, that's that ought to be part of the mix.
What about other things like what is it called, like ocean seeding or the...
Yep, all those are good things too. Carbon side geoengineering, carbon dioxide removal, CDR, is a reasonable set of, some people call them geoengineering, but they're climate modification or remediation, some people call it, technologies that I think are worth exploring. The solar side are not. I don't think squirting sulfate particles up to cool temperatures, you're not offsetting the same thing. You'll have ocean acidification, you've got termination effects. You also play hell with the global hydrological cycle, so that's a bad idea. But all those things are, all the CDR side I think is well worth exploring.
The story I sort of alluded to with the Amazon and biochar, but the story is to simply say is the Spanish went along and found these bountiful garden cities which were mostly built upon biochar and putting this carbon into the soil because it's mostly clay soils in the Amazon. Then they escaped. They left smallpox there, and when they came back 5 to 10 years later, they didn't find anything there. All they found were these gardens, and the guy was called a liar. But what actually happened, because of so much CO2 being pulled out of the atmosphere because it was so bountiful, is it caused a mini ice age in Europe, and that's what you can find in the climate records.
I've heard that. Honestly, I've never read the papers behind that, so I don't know what I think of that. But I certainly, it would need to be a large area effect, but there's no reason why not. You know, I don't know of any reason why not. But
I suppose with the cows, I was suggesting as a way to achieve that without disrupting the land use as it is now.
Quite possibly, yeah.
I've got an incoherent question, Dave. Sorry about that. It's something to do with how much of this is a technology problem.
Oh, yeah.
How much of this is a pricing problem, and how much of this is a social attitudes problem, and how much, if there's any residual, is it a policy problem?
So I think it's a policy problem about sending the right signals to make it a technology problem, which is the sort of thing that human beings are good at solving. And it's a policy problem via a pricing problem to send signals about that technology investment. And then I think the behaviour change comes on the back of that. So if you look at the eradication of slavery, which was a pernicious but all-encompassing institution until the coming of the fossil fuels, basically, it was eradicated in the places that had railways in the 1820s, in the same order, and there's this natural experiment in the United States in that sense. So places where you could have free labour that moved to cities and got involved in manufacturing, did. But the mopping up of slavery, the getting rid of it in its vestigial places, was something that took that behaviour change and social attitude shift to get rid of it. But the enablement, the preconditions of success were the fossil economy. If we didn't have mechanical labour, we would still have most people working on farms or in primary sectors or mines or something like that, and we would probably still have some form of unfree labour. So that's a slightly Marxian perspective, but I think that they are coupled, and the mopping up is done by social norms. But the enablement of really better futures is technology. But what can bring that forward is policy and price.
But just given the fact that, as Dave says, there are some scientists that that refuse to believe in climate change, who tend to be much older. It does show you that there is definitely a social dynamic to this as well.
But there's also an age profile. If I meet somebody who's 70, they may well not like what I do for a living. If I meet somebody who's a kid, they often are really excited about it. Except my son, obviously, who wants to be a hedge
wants to be a hedge fund manager. Yeah, fair enough too. Yes, sir.
G'day. Sorry if I actually came late, so if you're answering this question again, then I apologise to everybody else here. I just had a question for, obviously there's the people that make the argument that bigger countries do more emissions and they're more responsible and we can whatever. Do you, I don't know how to ask this, do you have a policy on how you would interact, if you made it into government, how you would interact with those countries like the United States or Australia?
So Dave's an expert. He won't be in government, thankfully. So that's us. But I mean, in terms of, from your perspective, you've already given your answer, which I actually agree with anyway. So perhaps do you want to?
Well, I like carbon clubs. I think try and create common border arrangements, work with countries that are doing progressive things on climate policy. It depends on national circumstance. If you've got a very rich country who's not doing anything on climate change, you ought to ask kind of why. So there are normally 3 distributional principles that are considered relevant to this problem. One is polluter pays, which we all accept when it's our pool that somebody's weighing into, right? The second is ability to pay, that it seems reasonable to ask people who have more to do more. And the third is beneficiary pays, where we ask the beneficiaries of fossil fuel industries to help foot the bill. And all of those point to rich countries that are polluting lots kind of leading the way. And
so in practice, while Dave's thinking of the next thing to say, how that would work is, the way we run GST, right? If something's produced here, we whack GST on it. If something turns up at the border, we whack GST on it too. Other countries have their own forms of GST which they take off at the border. So if we're exporting something, we don't charge GST on it, right? So you can basically set up a system which says, okay, if we're importing something from Europe, where they have a similar carbon charge to us, we'd say, okay, the BMW car from Europe is already paid for the carbon, so it's the same price here as it would be in Europe, But if you're importing something from dirty, stinking America, which is, cars do they make? Ford? they probably don't make any Fords anymore, but just say for the benefits of this conversation, would say, okay, we're going to charge a Ford car from America 25% more than we'll charge the BMW from Europe, because in Europe they've paid for the costs of the climate emissions. In America they haven't.
I'm glad you didn't choose Volkswagen.
Yeah, Volkswagen would be a terrible choice, wouldn't it? Because they've been cheating. Yeah. They've been cheating on that exact point. So that kind of,
Yeah, that would be an example of a policy.
Yeah, and of course we don't make any cars here, but if we did make cars here, then they would be paying the carbon charge too. But the point Dave made earlier is that and we were discussing earlier, is that the charge that we put on pollution in New Zealand is currently about half of what you see in Europe. So we're actually behind the leading countries in that respect.
Yeah.
Any final questions? Yes.
Earlier you mentioned sort of leading a carrot on a stick for leading companies like Fonterra away from the coal industry and stuff. What are some of the biggest obstacles you see in that sort of area?
Well,
I can tell you one of them while he's thinking. Is actually getting the electricity lines to the Fonterra factories, or the supply of biomass to the Fonterra factories. That's a massive thing. And if you've got, who's going to pay for that? Because they're a massive, and building an electricity line that can handle that kind of electricity, that's a big capital cost. In supplying biomass, then you've got to set up a supply system around that.
The other thing is that things like coal have a value because you can just stockpile it. Whereas the things like electricity, you're sucking a lot of electricity out of the grid all of a sudden. So it's thinking about it as a bit of a system, and I think government can do that. Government have an attitude to electricity especially that isn't fully market-based, and that's an opportunity for you guys actually to do more perfect market stuff that would actually help with some of these, even things like rainfall in the Southern Alps, where if the hydro lakes are low or high, it's hard to send a signal to consumers because of our norms around electricity and what sort of thing it is, and actually tidying some of that up is an opportunity. But there are lots of things you could do, I think, and one of them is just simply finding people a difference, because if they're making a decision now that commits them to emissions for 50 years or 30 years, and you think the average price on carbon will be higher than the one that they're using as a sort of shadow price, then I don't see why you couldn't use a stick as well as a carrot.
Sadly, I don't think Fonterra will be building any more boilers in a great hurry. For a variety of reasons. But basically their volume of milk is probably going to be shrinking for a little while because they've been performing so poorly. One last question today before we wrap up?
All right, I can give you one more. How does this all relate to ocean acidification? Are there any different kind of responses that we need to give thinking about that, or is it largely the same as the atmospheric?
I think it's largely the same stuff. I mean, it's the same driver. It's a concern. Warming oceans are a concern. I remember giving a talk that I didn't think was that downbeat to Aquaculture New Zealand, and they thought it was really downbeat, and they didn't invite me back, which is a shame because they put on this great food. But there are real challenges around that, I think. It's got the same fundamental driver, and you'll solve it or not over the same time scale, I think. So the two problems go together.
So if we do get down and say we live within our 1.5 degree budget, is the ocean going to be less acidic than it is now in that case, or is it going to stay? No,
I think it acidify a bit, but it wouldn't be terribly acidic. But it's more if you have those really high end fossil worlds, the ones where we accelerate greenhouse gas emissions, and those are possible. That would be where fertility rates track upwards again, where there's are coupled with economic decline. So people have more kids because they're uncertain about the future, and so the economy tanks. And there are no investments in energy efficiency, and everyone's just sort of looking after themselves and adopting have as many kids as possible so that 2 or 3 of them might last kind of. If you end up in that kind of pretty awful world, you could have some very high emissions. That's kind of how I see the top end scenario, a little bit of a nightmare world. And that would have, that in that sort of situation, you were acidifying the ocean way more than you would like.
And so just to finish on a vaguely depressing note.
Yeah.
But just to bring it back to that kind of sort of conversation about, having one eye to adaptation as well as to mitigation. Yeah. I mean, do you see any win-wins there?
On the adaptation side?
Stuff that we should be doing, absolute no-brainers we should be doing because it makes sense to do for adaptation and it makes sense to do for reducing emissions.
I wish you'd told me we were going to ask that as your last kicker question, but
you would have had a real blockbuster.
Yeah, I would have thought about it.
Yeah.
I think some forestry, some sort of forestry stuff, urban forestry or creating green spaces is a really good mitigation thing if you do get heat waves and warm periods. Obviously, the carbon locks up, the trees lock up carbon, or the greenery locks up carbon. There's a bunch of things like that. I think doing things other than concreting stuff, that's sort of the opposite because it enhances your vulnerability to extreme rainfall. It increases the heat island effect, and it's tons of cement. So there are. I think there's smart and dumb things to do that join the two.
In that in that world of urban planning.
And that's going to be a big thing. I think we've had a very sprawly urban history, and that's partly why we like that. And as New Zealanders, we like our quarter acre. We like, one of the things I wanted when we moved here from Britain was more space for kids. It's not inherently a bad thing, but it has to be. You have to think about it. You can't just photocopy quarter acre sections with tons of concrete and hope to go, we're going to reduce our emissions.
Yeah. I mean, I do. It does seem to make sense to densify in terms of reducing emissions and to bring down house prices at the same time.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. It's a challenge that can, if you meet the urban challenge, I think you can do a lot towards having a future that's better for an ageing population, that is more environmentally friendly and just has more flourishing people. So I think it's a really key area to look at.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for